2022 was a pretty weird year. We were out of lockdown, but also sorta not really, and time just sorta passed in a haze. It was quite generally just a mess of a year, between multiple family members in the hospital and being in a dead-end job I hated. It was just a bit of a downer, all things considered. Compared to 2021, where I played like 50 plus games and seemingly had infinite motivation, I only really played about 6 or 7 games over the course of 2022. It's the start of 2023 and I've already played half of that, so I dread the size of next year's video if I do one. This video is pretty late. I'd hoped to have it out late December, early January, but between the hospital visits I get hit with Ligma virus and I couldn't really talk for a few weeks without being sick. And then as I went to start recording the voiceover, I got in an accident where I ripped the entire nail off my big toe and I can't walk properly. So this is pretty delayed. Better late than never though, right? Right? Here's my retrospective. There's not really much you can say about Elden Ring that hasn't been said by virtually everyone else. They'll shower reverence to the fantastic open world, memorable boss characters, and how many times they probably lost to Millennia. That's fair play, and it is true, but it's been discussed to death, so I'll let them handle that, and I'll just talk about my own experiences. What sticks out in my mind almost a year later is the thing that I loved most wasn't really any of those things, but the organic nature of the exploration and co-op PvP. For the luxury of seamless co-op mode hit PC, I played the game almost entirely in co-op with several friends in several different runs. While my runs with my friend Dan and his mates were largely contained to the key areas, be it the legacy dungeons or meeting up at the entrance of a cave to do a mini dungeon, my run with Dara was the entire trek. So there never was a little horsey friend, never easy parkour, but just sauntering through the wilderness discovering things while being assaulted constantly by power-hungry gimps. Like Frodo and Sam before us, we walked everywhere, from Mullingar to Glasgow Prestwick, taking in the sights and avoiding people obsessed with a ring. One minute we'd happily be exploring the serene forest town by Hogwarts, with its big crab enemies and its little cheeky chaps that would do like those cartwheels. I loved that, but then for the 50th time that hour we'd be invaded, here comes Billy Big Bollocks with this little twink build. For those that don't play Souls or simply have self-respect, a twink build is basically like a Smurf account, a low-level alt by a person who has access to stronger equipment, weapons or accessories who's then passed it down to that account. All they want to do is make your playthrough more tedious, as your progress is reset upon death. For an open world game with an emphasis on exploring nooks and crannies to discover rare stuff or hidden bosses, this may deter some. There are those that play Soulsborne games in offline mode to avoid this aspect of the game. For us though, it became the absolute highlight. Especially because, as of the launch period, invaders were pretty much of a hive mind. Near enough every single one of them used the Rivers of Blood or Moonbow. Me and my friends would quickly develop irrational hatred for these weapons, especially the Rivers of Blood as the Moonbow was quickly patched. On top of how broken these weapons were in clearing PvE content, shredding bosses and essentially being free wins in PvP, they were both katana, adding a layer of further disdain for those try-hard, nothing personal kid weapons. To go on a brief tangent, one of my favourite things about Dark Souls 2 was the sheer amount of build variety possible, and that was certainly felt once again on Elden Ring. Unlike Dark Souls 3, which was kind of like a pump and dump and then forgetting their name in a haze kind of affair, or Dark Souls where I just tried to do several runs and found myself tapering off, quite like the analogy from the previous sentence, I relished finding and trying out new weapons in this game. I played and completed the game about 6 times in a row with drastically different builds, weapons and styles each time, a testament to how enjoyable the game actually is. Instead of just shotgunning a class and sticking with it, or trying out a bunch of things and never really committing, I would actually find something outside of my current character specs and be like, shit man, I'm gonna have to do a new run to test out this bad boy. To tie this back into the PvP, one of the coolest theorycraft aspects of the game is devising ways to troll the trolls. If people were going to come in and try to impede our progress, then we were going to waste their time or make sure they wished that they hadn't bothered. And there were so many ways of doing so. For once, status effects are all the rage. The Rivers of Blood itself procced a ludicrously broken bleed effect, which would melt bosses' health bars faster than steel beams in 9/11. Some of my favourites included a Spike Cestus punch build, named and styled after Kiryu from the Yakuza series, or my buff debuff cleric build Kanye Blessed, A bit awkwardly named now that he's been off his fucking rocker. My favourite of the lot was a dual sword user named Ira, inspired by a recent replay of Fire Emblem 4, who also had a bow as a backup. Both of our swords were duplicates of the Sword of St. Trina, the only weapon in the game that had sleep effects built into it. I had 2 of these and Dara had 2 of them. And the bow I mentioned was there for the sole purpose of using sleep bone arrows, which self-explanatorily caused the sleep effect. As a final addition, would craft throwable sleep pots. I think you probably get the gist of what we were trying to do. Anyway, invaders would come into a proud display of no honor gank squad behaviour. They would rush in, mashing the R1 button to do some elaborate katana flourishes, or send off mid-2000s Bleach styled laser attacks that is. We would then just coordinate our attacks so we would be constantly inflicting the sleep status on them, be it from the Trinas, the stabs, the dust attacks, the arrows or the pots. They would just start snoozing, almost as if they'd been forced to play Dying Light 2. As soon as they did, we would just run in and get free critical damage on them or throw Albinauric pots at them, being items that you use to prevent PvP healing. They would just come out with their sleep status, panic roll away and then try to chug their Sunny D to heal, only for the animation of the player to stare at their bottle confused and saddened would occur, much like me at 3 AM when I fancy a bowl of cereal and there's not enough milk left. They couldn't heal and we weren't giving them the chance to recover, so we'd just keep inflicting the sleep effect status until they died, gave up or disconnected. This may sound spiteful to you, and it is, but we loved it. The coup de grace of all this is that there's a weird series-wide tradition in that community of pointing down at a slain foe. To most people you'd just be like, whatever. For some reason though, for the PvP community of Elden Ring, this was like a holy affrontment to their pride. This was like paramount to pantsing them in front of their high school crush in gym class during a particularly cold day, and then going home and cucking their dad. To point down at them after beating them is to dishonour the very fabric of their being. So for every Rivers of Blood user, we would do the double point down, followed by spamming weird voice commands like, "You're beautiful." We're truly living our best lives being arseholes. Most people would simply move on, but most people would wait out the PvP cooldown time and try to get their revenge on us, only to be served more point downs. Eventually we discovered that an item called the Taunter's Tongue existed. Not only does this allow for extra PvP invaders, but it removes the cooldown for being invaded in the first place, so the same player could enter your game over and over immediately until you beat the boss of the area or simply leave. When we found that out, we would basically just dedicate sessions to either making legitimate progress in the game, or holding up in areas that would serve as good tactical strongholds for repelling a barrage of angry invaders. One of our favourite sessions was in the underground area close to the Old Palace ruins. Not only was there ample high ground, but loads of corners to hide around and recover if need be. One particular invader came in and got pointed down at on several occasions. He would immediately return for a few more rounds, dying until say the 5th attempt, where he got a lucky kill on the host and then retorted with his own point down. I think most rational people would take that victory as return the fortune and then just move on with his life. Loving it though, we turned on the Taunter's Tongue again and immediately within seconds he rejoined. He was hungry for the glory, chomping at the bit. Unfortunately for him though, we would then proceed to kill him like another 17 times, making sure to twist the knife with the point downs again. I can only imagine him throwing his hat down and stomping on it in impotent fury like Yosemite Sam in old Looney Tunes cartoons. Or maybe he was just bored, but that'd be no fun. Eventually though, from repeatedly killing him, we had dwindled all our resources and we just simply made the decision to go and beat the boss and move on with our lives. He would join us for one last hurrah though as we entered the boss room, being banished into obscurity. We've forgotten his username at this point, but I guess his memory lives on in this video at least. Like I said at the start, there's so much I could say about the bosses in the game, but I would only be repeating what others have said and probably covered more thoroughly. I loved my time with the game. For something that I wasn't even going to buy, I got my money's worth, playing over 300 hours. I was actually about to finally try the Trail series and get about 30 minutes into Sky before my friends Matt and Sash gifted me Elden Ring and Steam, which I'm still incredibly flattered and grateful for. They wanted to keep me away from that JRPG rabbit hole at any cost, it seems. There is something that I do feel conflicted about though, and it's part of the open world aspect itself. Being that I played Bloodborne about 8 years ago and then took a large gap before properly tackling all the Souls games in order in about 2020, communities had already firmly been established. Virtually everything I know about these games had been determined long before I showed up, be it from a dedicated community or data mining. This was the first time I was properly in one of these games at ground zero. quests, weapons, NPCs were all just being discovered and compiled in real time. PvP meta was being determined and experimented with. As cool as that was, part of me can't help but feel a little let down by some of the explorative aspects of the game. I'd always heard about how proud fans were about the obtuse design of these games, leading to discoveries even years after the release, even now for some of the prior entries, but something weird happened for Elden Ring. Over the course of starting and finishing the game, basically consuming my entire March and April, it seemed like near enough everything had already been discovered. It's kind of bizarre that the least linear game was fully documented in the fastest time to me. Quest lines, hidden stuff and whatnot had seemed to be solved within days and become shared common community knowledge. It's not a deal breaker by any means, but I wonder if the game had simply been less Miyazaki-ified? Or maybe the community is just simply too good at thinking outside the box and progression now. I do think that it's incredibly cool that word of mouth is a part of the experience. However, between this and how thorough my own exploration was, just by talking to friends about what they had found or sharing our information, we were able to basically find most optional dungeons without a guide. It's kinda disappointing that we saw what most of the game had to offer. I was expecting something really chunky. By the time I'd opened the dedicated community map on the wiki, we'd really only missed some cleverly hidden ones, but it was only like 3 or 4. Another part of the experience that makes me wonder if it's laziness or rewarding exploration is repeated bosses. Some people went into media blackouts for it and ran through the game in a weekend or a week not having any outside knowledge. Everyone's going to have a different experience of how they tackled the critical path, potentially the amount they invested into side quests, NPCs, optional dungeons. Most people will never see everything this game has to offer, and even less in their first and perhaps only run. As an example, there is a quest for an important NPC called Ranni. For many, her questline will be a game spanning affair. You can meet her after beating one of the first bosses in the game and she'll potentially gift you some items. It covers a sizable chunk of the game and involves many NPCs and outcomes depending on who you remain loyal to. Near the end of her questline you will be met with a boss named Estelle, Natural Born of the Void. This is an incredibly cool boss and one that ties into the thematic lore of the preceding areas in relation to Ranni herself. Or alternatively, if you don't do any of that, you can just meet a weaker clone variant of it in a random cave in one of the endgame areas with no fanfare whatsoever. This is where I can't decide if it's simply laziness on From's part, needing to fill out some open world checklist, or is it a cool inclusion that lets players who may have missed Ranni's quest the option to fight this memorable and unique boss? Is it my fault for exploring everything? Is that truly in the nature of the game? Or were people expected to find certain things and miss others to create a more tailored experience? It's really hard to determine. Beyond needing a certain amount of bosses killed to see the latter half of the narrative, the game is quite relaxed in what you can and can't do to get to the end game. For some, Estelle could never have been encountered in any form and it didn't negatively impact their experience. Despite ending on that note, I loved Elden Ring. If someone asked me to co-op it again, I would. I think I've had enough time between runs where I could have a fresh enough experience again, especially with all the patches that have come out since I played, or the aforementioned Seamless mod. It would be nice to not take 5 years to walk everywhere and actually ride my horse to luge. That was a torrent client joke. I'll let myself out. In 2022, I played Dying Light 2. It's tough being into Musou and Fire Emblem. You wouldn't think the two would have much in common prior to the original Fire Emblem Warriors, but they're both the targets of people who hate their respective series without actually having touched one, forming opinions through osmosis from internet personalities, or just the vendetta against anime swords in a fighting game. As a long-time fan of both, I long for a crossover of these two series, both medieval in nature. It seemed a match made in heaven. It always seemed like an impossibility though, with other crossover titles being Gundam or One Piece, and up until a point, Fire Emblem was an incredibly niche series. Fire Emblem Warriors would eventually get announced, making me unsure if I was having a fever dream. The possibilities were endless. Most Fire Emblem games have a cast of like 30 to 40 playable characters and around 5 or 6 recurring villains. Most of the games are self-contained duologies with their own lore, dynamics and mechanics. A crossover had so much potential in the ways of character interaction or movesets. So to say I was disappointed when it only featured the cast of Awakening, Fates and Shadow Dragon sprinkled in as an appeasement to the Kaga boomers, it was an understatement. I'm not a gatekeeper though, and there are some good aspects of Awakening and Fates that I enjoyed, so I would try to make the best of a bad situation. And in there was a genuinely really fun game. Sure, the roster left a lot to be desired, and characters like Lyn and Celica were shamelessly added for superficial reasons, like Lyn being the West equivalent of Marth and Baby's first wife, or the developer just really having a weird Gaiden obsession and coincidentally putting Celica in the game before they even realised they were remaking it. The history mode had a lot of nice nods to previous games and some fun objective based levels. It was genuinely one of the most fun Musou spin-offs I'd ever played. The Fire Emblem weapon triangle, the tactics system and the permadeath meshed so well with the Musou formula. I was positive that with some refinement, a sequel with reps from all entries could be a tremendous game. I'd say one of the only downsides is that the story was really terrible. Not that the Fire Emblem series for the most part is going to win a Pulitzer Prize, but still, the OCs were so bland that it's a challenge in itself for most people to even remember their names. As a final nail in the coffin, even when it was being cross-promoted in Fire Emblem Heroes, they never added those characters, and still haven't to my knowledge. I gave up on Heroes years ago, but I like looking at the art and voice acting. Even Tokyo Mirage Sessions got stuff in it, that's when you know. Another issue is that there were a load of clones. Some like Warriors Orochi 4 Ultimate, which won the Guinness World Record for most distinct playable characters in a game at 177 total. Each of those people have a unique moveset and weapon archetype. In Fire Emblem Warriors, there's 32 characters, including the 9 DLC characters, with around half of them sharing clone movesets with another. One of the more jarring examples is Marth and Celica sharing a moveset when he's a Lodestar Lord and Celica is a magic wielding priestess. A few years passed and it didn't seem like Fire Emblem Warriors would actually get a sequel. A bit of a shame, but not particularly shocking. Then out of nowhere we got a sequel to not only Fire Emblem Warriors, but a game promises like a side story to the latest mainline entry, Three Houses, with a lot more input from Incies themselves. To go back to the Heroes tangent, Shay was immediately recognised as someone within that continuity and had multiple appearances. It was a good sign. It seemed like we were getting the treatment that Age of Calamity got, hopefully without the cock block and another 7 frames per second performance. It was really cool and unexpected honestly, but I did feel some dread that it would be returning to the continent of Fodlan, as Three Houses online discussions could charitably be called a shit show, and less charitably a fucking nightmare of no one playing more than one route and digging their heels into their own biases. Starting off with Shay as a lead, I genuinely really liked him. I played as a male version and a female Byleth in my first run, so for ease of access I'll just refer to them as him and her from now on. I felt he fit quite nicely into the world, had a believable enough motivation in surpassing Byleth and getting revenge upon her. He wasn't one note like Rowan and Leanne of Warriors, and he had pretty good chemistry with the already established characters. I think I'm more endeared to him than Byleth honestly, but I guess it's not that hard to be better written than a largely mute character. But he was chipper, upbeat and determined, and didn't just stand around like a corpse during dramatic or sad scenes blankly staring. Speaking of, I don't mind the Byleth of Three Hopes, but in the attempt to justify her being a mute in Three Houses, she's still very quiet and muted. Speaking of those recurring characters, due to the plot elements introduced in Three Hopes, there's a 2-year time skip rather than the 5-year time skip in the RPG. For the most part, I think these new designs are fantastic, blending the best of both worlds in regards to the pre and post time skip designs from Houses. I've seen the cynical take that they only got these new designs so they could further sell alts and heroes. Part of me wouldn't really put it past them, but I'll give them the benefit of the doubt honestly. If they just had the same designs they would have been called lazy. There's not really a scenario in which they could have won. Plus it's not like there's any logic to the alts and heroes anyway, they just take a popular character and do whatever. Lyn and Camilla have like 10 alts in the Booba Olympics and they have nothing to do with their core designs really. One of the strongest aspects of the RPG version were the characters. I think pretty much everyone could agree on that. And I feel for the most part, it was nice seeing them expanded upon and new supports, be it with Shay, people they just never supported with before, or newly introduced characters. It helps to add a bit more depth to them. In regards to those new characters, many of them were people who were alluded to in Houses, but were never really given any screen time or weight in the narrative. Having them here just makes the world feel a bit more fully realised in the lore. Regarding the story, I'm quite positive on it. Hopes is basically alternate tales of what could have occurred in Fodlan. Many aspects of the game feel like what Inces wanted to incorporate into the RPG in the first place, and some feel like what ifs. I'm trying to be as spoiler free with this as possible, so I'll just summarise it as, what if Edelgard had been given time to fight the Mole Man? What if Claude had been given the opportunity to have a greater conflict with Elmyra? What if Dimitri was slightly less mentally ill and didn't just kill women, but murder them? What if Fire Emblem dads were allowed to live? I feel like Fodlan has the potential to be almost as well realised as Yggdrasil or Tellius, but the problem with both of these entries is over-ambition. Three Hopes has the task of filling in some of the blanks and potential plot holes of Three Houses, and for the most part I give it credit. The issue is, like its RPG predecessor, it also leaves so many things unaccounted for. Many plot threads are introduced and expand upon the world, the villains, or the characters themselves, but either due to poor planning or budget constraints were just kinda left unresolved, and that is quite questionable because I cannot see a return to Fodlan in the cards. The game started development as a true sequel to Fire Emblem Warriors before morphing into this guidance story for the latest popular entry, meaning that a future title will either be a true crossover culmination of the series or a side story to a future mainline entry like Engage. It's a bizarre scenario Hopes finds itself in, being both an upgrade and a downgrade to its source material, and we're just left hanging on those plot threads. Some I don't really mind, it's good to speculate and not have all the answers, but some are just like, well, why did you introduce that for no payoff? Regarding the gameplay, that too isn't a weird side grade from the first Warriors. As I said earlier, people complained about the clones, so did they fix the issue? Well, no, not really, they actually kinda doubled down on it. Instead of forced classes, everyone, like in Three Houses, has the ability to respec into anything you want, so recurring classes such as Myrmidon, Archer and the usual suspects become archetypes. There's less unique playstyles now, but at the same time any character can become anything. It opens up the same kind of cool build variety as the RPG. Both classes and weapons give unique skill opportunities and playstyles now, and some of the major characters do still have their own unique classes to distinguish themselves too. It does mean that instead of putting that time into creating unique playstyles and making everyone stand out, they can add extra characters that weren't playable in houses like Monica, Rodrigue or Host, but for no reason it's still quite restrictive. Characters that are present in the story mode such as Judith in Claude's story still aren't playable, even though she has a class and AI program for her. It's just kinda strange really. Although I do think unlike Dynasty Warriors this is the best compromise to have everyone represented in a future possible Musou game. Give everyone a unique combo finisher but keep the classes fundamentally the same, like they would be in the core series. A good start would be like a unique chain finisher for the preferred weapon. If you were to ask me what do I prefer between Houses and Hopes, I would probably say Hopes. Not like I dislike Houses, but I just think Hopes has more replayability by polishing the aspects that made Houses' pacing so bad. The campsite is just less tedious to traverse in the monastery, and everything I loved about the original Warriors has been refined, such as the objective types and the maps and the character switching on the fly to keep up battle flow. Hopes also just has less overlap, route-wise. There are some cross-sections later on, but for the most part there's a unique perspective in each campaign. It's less restrictive in the sense that instead of going through the same maps in a time skip and fighting each other, they'll have their own unique threats that the other parties just don't have any knowledge of. I do love both, and it's sad that there is no definitive best Fodlan experience, but if you're in Hopes for dumb fun you can hardly go wrong, unlike Edelgard. Oh man, did we hype this one up. When we saw that concept art of Takuma and Agumon sitting in the ruined classroom with the promise that it would be a dark strategy RPG where choices mattered and death could come at any time, I think most folk had at least a half lob on. Between that premise, the genre and Survive being in the title, comparisons were rife to the phenomenal Devil Survivor Overclocked, considered one of the best strategy RPGs about with its branching paths, well written characters, gameplay and death mechanic. So, did Digimon live up to those comparisons? Short answer, no. Long answer, no. The game went through an incredibly troubled dev cycle and apparently started over from scratch at least once. That would lead to several delays and the question if it would ever actually release in the first place. The delay and sheer lack of information would weirdly work in its favour as speculation ran rampant. One of the more positive aspects about the Digimon series of games, despite being less popular of course, is that it's not stuck in such a rigid formula as its biggest competitor in the Mon business, the mainline Pokemon games. There's dungeon crawlers, traditional JRPGs, monster raising sims, adventure games and such, so anything could be possible when it would actually release. So the gameplay then, Devil Survivor, it ain't. It is a grid-based strategy RPG, but there's not much meat in the bone. At a casual glance you'd make the closer comparison to Final Fantasy Tactics, and I suppose it is like that game except way more tedious. There is a rock paper scissors mechanic as usual with the vaccine data and virus types, but honestly it never matters, there's not much strategy in this RPG. The most interesting mechanic is on the fly digivolving, which theoretically could create loads of possible strategies, but in practice just adds extra time to the level and removes what little difficulty there actually was. You're just going to be curb stomping lower tiered foes as high level Digimon really take their time appearing outside of bosses till late in the game. The animations, even just the movement on the field are glacial, and this is a weird complaint, but Digimon ascending or descending elevation for some reason makes the sound of a jet engine taking off. It's so loud. I'm trying to keep this video spoiler free for narratives, so I'll just say the story is easily the best aspect of the game. That should be the case though when it's 75% visual novel and 25% RPG. Digimon fans especially will probably get some mileage out of it. The characters for the most part are pretty interesting, and the story, true to its promise, does get grim pretty fast. From my first run I was pretty invested in it while the inner workings were still a mystery to me. There are 3 branching endings on your first run, and on a second playthrough the true ending opens up. I will say the story does fall apart under scrutiny however. You're basically not involved in how things play out in your first run, and the gameplay is fundamentally the same in every route until 8% of the way through. That point being where you arbitrarily decide what ending you feel like having. To go back to the Devil Survivor comparison where you could save anyone and everyone except the route locked characters, nothing really matters until New Game Plus, and only then if you choose the true ending. I played through all the routes in succession, and honestly all I saw was the effects of crunch and a lack of budget. It was pretty tragic. All in all, I just feel bad more than anything. There is a really strong foundation, and while I didn't mention it, the visuals are super clean. The character art and the sprites are just extremely pleasing to look at. I don't really feel good tearing the game apart because it's not a bad game, it's just kinda mediocre and linear. I hope there is a sequel to improve on what is a great concept. I would say this is the closest feeling to adapting an actual Digimon anime in tone, just mired by tedious gameplay, lack of objectives and poor route diversity. I just think we got too cocky before release. We expected Michelin and ended up with a Greggs. Cheap and quite tasty, but you won't be taking your next date there to impress them. Oh man, speaking of getting too cocky, I absolutely love Deadly Premonition. It's a bizarre, janky, lovable gem of a game. I showed it to everyone I could years ago. It's the only game I ever LP'd on this channel when I had the misguided goal of thinking I could become a YouTuber like 11 years ago. I had it in 360, then I bought it in PS3, PC and even Switch. Everybody knows how janky the first game was, so a certain amount was expected when 2 dropped. So on release for Switch when it ran at 10 frames per second, some people were like, oh haha, old Sweaty does it again. Although this time it wasn't unintentional. This wasn't because of a small budget and death fell between console generations, this was just because the Switch ran it like dog shit. I tried to ignore it and play on for my boy Yorick, but after several constant crashes making the game borderline unplayable, I just gave up on it, praying to whatever data you choose for a port to any other console or PC. And thankfully my prayers were answered. The game runs fine in PC, hallelujah. So this time I pushed on through to the ending. I was really conflicted on it. Once again, the major characters are incredibly charming, and I did find myself invested in the mystery. However, unlike the original, some parts of the narrative and sidecasts are a bit too quirked up. To use a comparison, something I love about Twin Peaks, the original Deadly Premonition and the Yakuza series, is the juxtaposition between tones. Yes, the characters are incredibly campy and weird, but it's always played straight in what I call the Leslie Nielsen effect. There should be a nice balance where one minute you can be laughing in disbelief and another emotionally invested in the drama, a hard goal to achieve in your writing. In Deadly Premonition 2, many moments seem to be, I don't know, random for the sake of it. It was nice to see York treat them with severity, perfectly in character and what I desired, but some of them get to the point where your own suspension of disbelief is tested. Several characters are just done really dirty too by the conclusion. The biggest problem with the game for me though is what I call Shenmue syndrome. The game relishes on wasting your time. Between every story beat you have to go and meander about the barren open world and either sleep in the hotel or venom snake your way through a pack of cigarettes. It's really arbitrary and only serves to pad out the playtime. If you shotgunned the critical path without needing those breaks, the pacing would be better and it would be about a third shorter, giving it some much needed brevity. I won't pretend that meandering wasn't part of the original game, but in that you had the opportunity to go and do side missions that would expand upon the town and its citizens. They were always fully voiced, and beyond providing extra perspective for the story a lot of the time, it would provide you with new outfits, new weapons, new cars, or even the ability to change the weather and time of day. They felt like tangible rewards. In Deadly Premonition 2, everything is relegated to shooting stray animals or picking items up off the ground for an hour before handing them to someone, and then you can craft a charm that gives you like 1.6 chance of 3 extra bullets in your clip if you had a Twix that day. It's just a complete waste of time. To go back to the story, I feel around the 2/3 mark it really starts to lose some steam and become almost bad. That said, if you push on past it, ties to the previous game finally layer in and the game starts going off the rails in a really positive way, culminating in a really enjoyable endgame and conclusion. It's weird that the game I dreamed of and never expected to actually get created would end up being such a mixed bag. I think you should still experience it if you loved the first game, but I think this is where the series should end. The first game felt like FK in the coffee, and this feels like Swery is forcing down a Sinner's sandwich. Relatively tasty, but self-inflicted punishment to atone for cancelling Dark Dreams Don't Die Season 3. I'll start this section off by saying that anyone who knows me claims I have an abusive relationship with this game. When the original Overwatch came out, I briefly played a lot of it on PC and console. I thought it was a really fun game with distinctive characters who all had a function. I'm not really big into competitive multiplayer. I vastly prefer co-op games, mostly as a result of not being into FPS games in general and how hyper competitive I get. People dub me Red Rusty over how pissed off I got at the game, which kinda leads me to why I dropped the original. Despite having a lot of fun with it, randoms not doing objectives just really frustrated me to the point of quitting, and seemingly most of the player base. Only the die-hard fans and Nakumas remained. For years, Overwatch would simply become the porn generator game. Beyond its attractive characters getting bent over the bins, I didn't hear anything about it. A flavour of the month it had simply been moved on from. So when 2 got announced, between those previous experiences and my general apathy towards any Blizzard IP, I just ignored it. It wasn't until a week after release, depressed in my dead-end job, that my so-called friends Riff and Daryl preyed upon me, much like a newborn in a David Attenborough documentary. "Oh come on," they said, "stop being a dry shite and click on some heads with us, stop being Dr. No." They assured me that it would be fun to jump on with the lads, so I installed the game hoping this time it would be the winter of my discontent. And very briefly it was. I had something to look forward to on my lunch breaks or when I would come home from work. The game was just as fun as I remembered from the honeymoon period of the original. It was just a shame that I was in another honeymoon period. Things rarely seem to change though. Just as Overwatch 2 in its current state is essentially the first game with one less hero and bigger arses, the player base, despite ostensibly being different people, still have the same mentality. Refuse to work as a team, refuse to do the objective, blame others for your mistakes. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I'm top 500, I'm probably just mediocre at a push. That said, I watch some of my teammates in games and I wonder how they function with a sheer lack of game sense, survivability, or willingness to work together to do an objective. So many people seem to think they're that guy, typically Genji players, going gex deep undercover into a full team, dying and then rage quitting, or if it's in ranked, throwing a strop and then hurling insults at you. Beyond that, I guess I just hate the lies of the devs regarding balancing. The live service model nature meant that they would get patches out rapidly to combat abuse and stagnant play. Throughout its so far 2 seasons, several meta have been rampant, centred around who's ludicrously overpowered from the last patch, or exploiting glitches like the one where Tracer had no fall off damage, or Pharah having triple speed ults, further highlighting their own incompetence. Another thing that shits my chips is the blatancy of the events like Battle for Olympus, which on top of not fixing the persistent balancing issues, and more importantly are just kinda shit, serve as bait. They let you play in these paid premium skins, tempting you while whispering in your ear that you look so sexy in those. Why don't you spend 16 quid getting them for the PvP mode? Nah, no thanks. At the end of the day, I love the core gameplay loop, and I feel like I'm getting better and better at it, which feels satisfying, but it's a co-op game, and if there's anyone I don't trust on the internet, it's randoms. I'm trapped in an existential hell where I actually want to play this fun game, but do I take the mental hit of playing with people who I'm not sure aren't government agents sent in to break the last of my sanity? Like the Hotel California, I'm just a prisoner of my own device, and I can check out any time I like, but I can never leave. Samurai Warriors 5 is a reboot that no one asked for, but it is fun. I could end it there because that kinda summarises how I feel, but we already had Dying Light 2 earlier on in the scathing review section. Like I said 5 games ago, it's tough being a Musou fan. I mentioned the outside memory, but we also have it from the creators themselves. Omega Force have put a weird amount of effort into the licensed games, with both Persona 5 Strikers and Three Hopes being great, and Pirate Warriors 4 being pretty good. In their home turf though, they've shat the bed and laid in the wet patch. They released Dynasty Warriors 9, which was so hilariously buggy, tragically squandered its better than ever retelling of the period, and butchered its gameplay, which for many wasn't winning any awards as it was. You would think then from the awful reception it earned they would quickly learn and be like, well, okay, we tried something new, nothing wrong with making an attempt, but let's get back to formula. Nah, they just released Dynasty Warriors 9 Empires, which was the exact same except they cut the horrific open world and made little square arenas from it from the leftovers. So it was with some trepidation that its sister series, set in the Japanese Warring States era, had announced an entry that had quietly went under the radar for years, being Samurai Warriors 5. Years later we'd finally get some information and footage, gone with the established cast of character designs and for the most part their voice actors. Instead, we had a twinkified version of them and a story solely about the bromance of Nobunaga Oda and his bestie Akechi Mitsuhide. For anyone that doesn't know, they have a bit of a tiff. People were dooming pretty hard, including myself honestly. I try not to judge a game too harshly before it's released because we don't have the full picture, but given Koei's track record here, it was a bit justified. I did end up buying the game, giving it the benefit of the doubt, but between Musou burnout at the time and my general indifference to the new portrayal of Nobunaga, I bounced off it. It wasn't until this November, for whatever reason, when I quit my job, I had the urge to revisit and complete the game, and it was fun. Going in with lower expectations and a more open mind on the designs, I restarted the game and finished it over the course of a week. I don't think anyone needs an explanation on how a Musou game plays, especially since Three Hopes was on earlier on. It's Samurai Warriors 4 but with the manual skill system from Pirate Warriors 4 and the class system of Three Hopes. It was still cathartic fun, running between objectives and preventing ambushes, escorting siege units and taking out enemy officers. They hadn't really learned anything though. The hyper attacks are still in check from the previous entries. To explain, there are two combo chain starters, a strong style designed to go through guards and the hyper style, basically dashing attacks that force forward momentum but cannot damage officers or bosses. The problem with this is that the maps are typically pretty big, and those objectives I mentioned are often spread out. This is a good thing because it makes you prioritise certain tasks within the flow of the map. You spread out your characters so you can switch to them and cover your bases with forethought or reaction. You're supposed to use horses for covering ground, but there's no downsides to just hammering the Y button for hypers. You move just as fast as your horse, and you can rack up kills and fire up your skill gauges. Overall, I think it's a pretty good retelling of Nobunaga's story from noob to unifier, and the change in his mentality from cocky upstart to detached determinism was pretty cool. It finally made me buy Spirit of Sanada, which in the same vein covers Yukimura Sanada's life. I'd always been kind of indifferent to it, but if it's as interesting as this is, I have high hopes. My only real complaint is since the game tackles the area from two perspectives, there are a lot of levels that pointlessly overlap and it feels like padding. Do we really need to play the same historical battle from two different perspectives with no changes? So yeah, like I said at the start, despite it being a reboot that no one asked for, besides maybe Japanese Fujoshi, I had fun, and it got me in the mood to stay in that historical period. This video is turning into a History Channel documentary. Unintentionally through games, I get really into Asian history somehow. Warriors, Sengoku Basara, Onimusha and more. They really love to cover this time period. While I do prefer the Chinese Three Kingdoms setting, the Sengoku era is still pretty interesting. When I was in school, outside of Scottish history, I thought it was a pretty boring subject. I didn't want to learn about boring wars where people died miserably in trenches. It wasn't until games covered these time periods I discovered how interesting it could be. Political conspiracies, constant backstabbing, rebellion and upheaval. The games dramatised it and then I would do further reading on my own. Please don't hit me with the History Japan option select in the comments. So after Samurai Warriors 5, I finally started Nioh. I'd actually played the alpha demo or whatever that was in PS4 years ago and thought it was kinda shit, but over the years I had to listen to the hipster brigade of Isa, Diz and more constantly go on about how good the Nioh games were and how they're so much better than the Souls series, which they're often compared to. So in December I finally gave it a go. Starring white boy William Adams, in this a swashbuckling Irishman rather than the accurate Englishman. Perhaps because Englishmen abroad historically were a bit naughty, and Ireland are second only to Japan themselves in being glorified by foreigners. William has his little JoJo stand, Saoirse, so named to give him actual credibility as being Irish, kidnapped by evil philosophers exploiting a magical substance named Amrita, currently being harvested from Japan. So, true to his white boy nature, he heads to Japan to go and get her back. He avoids the touristy stuff like heading for Akiba, but he still adheres to the time-honoured tradition of not learning a word of Japanese. Almost hilariously so. People talk to him in Japanese all the time and he doesn't even bother responding. There's a bunch of weapons that William can bash people and demons to death with, and I made them appropriate the culture by using the Kusarigama, a chain with a scythe, partially because a character in Samurai Warriors 5 I really liked used one, and it was pretty satisfying. You have three stances in the game. A lower defensive one, a normal one, and a higher, more offensive style, which comes in handy in a variety of ways. Low stance attacks were useful for smaller enemies, rapidly attacking and breaking through their guard. Higher stance for quickly doing as much damage as possible against an enemy with a bigger hitbox, typically bosses. Within these were useful attacks like a sweep that would set up a finisher on humanoid enemies, a counter on the mid stance, or on the high stance a sub-zero like get over here attack. I did try and level the other weapons in the meantime, but none of them had the diversity I was looking for that the Kusarigama provided. Another cool aspect of the combat was the key system, basically an active reload from Gears of War that allowed you greater stamina recovery and the ability to make riskier plays. Enemies and bosses range from samurai to demons inspired by Japanese folklore. Overall, I thought all the bosses were really fun to fight, with only one of them being a more scripted, tedious affair. Weirdly, an early completely optional boss kicked my dick in to the point where I thought I'd be firing blanks, that being Tachibana Minoshige, who I found ludicrously unfair for that point in the game. It took almost 90 tries to beat him, but I never had any struggle with any of the main bosses throughout the story. No one took more than 4 attempts ever. I don't know if they played their hand too early, I'm too good, or I improved so much from slamming my head against the wall, but the balance had just felt weird. The story is primarily set following the deaths of the two would-be unifiers, Nobunaga and Hideyoshi, and the aftermath that would culminate in the Battle of Sekigahara, basically a Hell in a Cell winner-takes-all match for the country, fought by Ieyasu Tokugawa and Ishida Mitsunari. William basically serves as a ghostbuster for hire, working with Ieyasu's subordinate ninja Hanzo, Given that I had existing knowledge of how the real battle played out, it was satisfying to see Neo's take on it. Whenever I saw a famous warlord I knew, or they would turn into a mythological demon that I knew from, say, Megami Tensei, I couldn't help but do the Leo point. Some people get better treatment than others, however. Nohime, the wife of Nobunaga, in death is turned into the still beautiful Yuki Onna. Meanwhile, Ieyasu's former wife Senahime isn't doing as well when she's been turned into Ogress. It was also cool to see Yasuke in the game, and he was actually voiced by a black guy, because in Samurai Warriors 5, while a solid character portrayal, he was bizarrely voiced by the whitest man alive. So yeah, I really enjoyed Neo. I thought it was a cool little action game. But that's not enough for the gamers. Now they're like, no, we didn't mean play the original, that's shit, it's 2 that's based. What? Make up your mind, Christ! Anyway, I'm looking forward to Neo 2, and I probably will play it soon, but I do admit I'm more excited for Wo Long given that I love Three Kingdoms more. And that was my 2022. If you actually watched all this video, thanks. I hope you found something that you might enjoy, or found any of my anecdotes amusing. Have a good year in 2023, and I'll see you this time next year to tell you if Resident Evil 4 Remake was good or not, 9 months after everyone else has.